I've just paid off my £70,000 London taxi, £1,087 a month, every month for 5 years. But I can't just sit back and relax because there's a shelf life on this taxi before I have to buy another taxi and go through the cycle all over again. And be sure to stay tuned because I'll be answering the question of, was it worth it? When you become a London taxi driver, there's two ways of getting into a taxi. You either rent a taxi from a fleet who has lots of taxis, or you buy your own one. Now, naturally, I saw this equation as very similar to renting versus buying a house. Everyone always says buying a house is a good asset, so I thought, right, buying a taxi would be a good asset. I did have to start with renting first of all, because these are very expensive vehicles, and it's generally wise to understand the job a little bit. So I did just that. When I first got out and started driving a cab, every London taxi was a diesel. TX2s, TX4s, they all look the same. They were broadly the same components. An old one cleaned up could look like a new one. I thought, well, hold on a minute, they've all got the same meter, so every London taxi, whether it's brand new or old, earns the same money. Why don't I just buy an old one that I can clean up, make it look like a new taxi, and then I'm going to be even more quids in? Why would anyone want to buy a new taxi? Well, we'll park that thought and we'll come back to that in a minute. So, to start off, to see if I actually like the job, well, I had to start by renting a taxi. So, I came here to Black Taxi Rentals in Edmonton, North London, where I rented my very first TX4 for £240 a week. The thing I couldn't quite understand when it came to taxi rentals was why some drivers would pay so much to rent a taxi. Generally, it was done by age. So, the newer the taxi, the more you would pay. Mine was £240 for a 12 plate, so it was around 5 or 6 years old at the time of renting it. Now yes, the newer the vehicle, the probably more likelihood it's going to be that it's more reliable. And if it's more reliable, the less chance of downtime and having to take it back to the garage. Remember, the great advantage with renting a taxi is that the fleet owner covers sort of all the maintenance. Shout out to Eugene, I know he wanted some free promo, but yeah, Black Taxi Rentals, that's where I rented for the first year and a half of my taxi journey. Now you might think fleet owners would be pretty pissed off with me if I rented from them and I say, you know what, I'm done with renting, I'm going to buy my own taxi. But they know that every individual taxi driver will have their own circumstances and they might come back in the future. I'll come on to that later on in the video. Renting my 2012 TX4 was awesome. Here I was in this brand new profession, earning good money. I was able to save, put money aside and really get a feel for the job. But then came my very first problem. One of the sole reasons why I became a London taxi driver was so I could control my income. I really wanted to get a mortgage, get on the property ladder. First problem was that by being self-employed, I had to build up 2 or 3 years of books to satisfy mortgage criteria. If I wanted to buy my own London taxi, therefore kind of build for the future and have maximum profit earning potential, I would not be able to buy a London taxi and have that finance against my name because it would upset mortgage criteria. A mortgage lender will just look at that amount of finance on my file as an unsecured loan. They couldn't distinguish that that is actually a business vehicle and not just £70,000 spent on a Porsche or something like that. So it was either a mortgage or a taxi. Then came along a second problem to my master plan. It was announced at the end of 2017 that no new diesel vehicles could be licensed as London taxis. And then in subsequent years, the lifespan was cut on these vehicles from 15 years down to 12 years. My master plan of buying an older TX2, TX4 was kind of dead in the water. You could see this as fleet owners began to invest heavily within the brand new TXEs and gradually over time downsizing their fleet of TX4s. The TX4s were great because you could repair them like a traditional vehicle, and if you only did a few days a week, it was much cheaper in rent. If I wanted to invest in my own vehicle, it wouldn't be a used TX4, it would have to be a brand new TXE. So a year and a half later, I trundled my way down to here, LEVC, Brewery Road, and put down £5,000 deposit and signed myself up to 5 years of hire purchase of a London electric taxi. Absolutely astounded me, because if I went to go to a mortgage broker and borrow a similar amount of money on a house over 25 years, They wanted to see 2-3 years proof of books and credit checks, everything. Here, I had a basic credit check, but I walked in with a debit card and I'm like, hey, can I have a London taxi, please? No proof or anything, I was even a taxi driver. Nuts, really, but that's car finance for you, I guess. And ownership was great. The numbers were very similar to what I was paying at a rental garage, but I had a brand new taxi. Added to the fact that each monthly payment was actually paying off the taxi rather than going into the fleet owner's pocket. Even with the very expensive insurance bill of £4,000 for the first year, I was still about the same as renting one of those older diesel taxis. Everything was going great until COVID.
Don't take public transport, go to work, don't go to work.
Insert any crisis here. Could have been a recession, pandemic, whatever. If I rented a taxi, I had ultimate freedom. I could just give it back to the garage. But as I was locked into a finance plan, I had to find £1,087 and a penny every single month, whether there was work coming in or not. Now, I eventually got through this as the finance company, Black Horse, offered payment breaks because of the extended circumstances. So I had to take 6 of those, just from a cash flow perspective, to ensure that I was good. Because remember, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was going out and sometimes I was earning about £50 a day. It doesn't really keep the ship afloat. Plus, I had a little bit of help from the government in terms of the COVID-19 support payments. I went on universal credit for a brief period of time, and I even opened up my own bicycle repair shop because there was good incentives to do so during the pandemic, utilising some previous skills there. So at least I was actually able to earn something and soften this blow a little bit. But the lesson learned was that it exposed me. Yes, in an ideal scenario, I could go out on any day, any time, and go and earn some money. There's going to be some times that are going to be better and sometimes they're going to be worse, but overall, you would like to think I could earn some money. However, in a period like this, or perhaps, if there's a recession looming, it just proved that my job wasn't quite as reliable as I thought it was. Thankfully, everything bounced back. I paid my £1,087 and a penny every single month. I went out, worked in the taxi, and worked pretty diligently on this YouTube channel. Fast forward to now, and this taxi is paid off. So, I'm paid up. I'm £1,087 and a penny better off every month. And I remember quizzing a cab driver many years ago who was telling me that his cab was paid off. I said, wow, must be amazing. You're like £1,000 better off every month. And he said, nah, it doesn't necessarily work like that. You become lazy. Because you're not having to find that money, you don't work so hard to go out and get it. It was one of the motivating factors when I rented from a garage, because you saw the money go out every single week. You had to make rental money, because you knew at the end of the week you had to pay it. And the same with the monthly payment of the taxi. No different than your mortgage, right? You've got to be careful with what you spend to cover your rent, your mortgage, all those basic outgoings. And besides, why work more just to pay more in tax? Next point. Yeah, I am that sad. I've got a taxi pillow and I sleep next to a map of London. Yeah. Problem number 5 of cab ownership is less expenses. As a self-employed business owner, I love expenses because it helps drive down my tax bill. Okay, yes, you can argue that if you have less expenses, that's more money in my back profit. Back profit? Back pocket. Let's do some quick scratch pad maths here. Let's say I turn over £50,000 over the year. We know that my cab is £13,000 just for the cab. Then I've got about £1,500 in insurance, and then let's chuck in, I don't know, £2,000 for petrol. That then means that we have tax deductible expenses of £16,500, which means £33,500 is our profit. Nice, but then we got to work out our tax. Now about £12,500 roughly is tax free. The income that is taxed is £21,000. Equals, roughly, we're talking about £4,200 tax. Nice. If we do the same calculations without the taxi, means we've got a profit of 47,000. So that then takes us down to 34.5 Okay, taxable, which then means our tax is going to be around 6,900. Just over £2,500 extra in tax. £6,900 of tax versus 4,200. Let's go back to my paid off example. Because of this turnover, or rather this profit here, we're quite close to the higher rate income tax threshold. The higher rate income tax hasn't gone up since 2017. And obviously we've hit high inflationary periods. So what this means is that the meter price has gone up and up over time, meaning that it's much easier for turnover to be higher, just the cost of stuff has gone up. But because the income tax threshold hasn't moved up in line with inflation, it's quite a bit easier to move into higher rate threshold. So effectively, every 20 quid I turn over in the cab means that it's subject to £8 tax. So I only keep £12 for every 20 quid I turn over. So it's quite a bit disincentivizing to work that much harder. You might be like, oh, woe is me, but it's nice to have an expense to kind of offset this. And don't forget, if you've got a student loan like I have, then it's something else to bear in mind with your earnings as well. Let's say you do a job on Get and it's £20, right? Get take their 20% cut, so you're down to £16. Now take off your minus 42% for your higher rate tax and national insurance. I'm now left with £9.28. So I've done a £20 job and it's more than halved because of Get taking their bit, the tax man taking his bit, and we're down to there. Now the app fee is tax deductible, so it's maybe not going to be quite that bad. But what I'm trying to explain about this higher rate threshold is that because of how our meters are raised each year in line with inflation, it's really easy to jump into that higher rate threshold. And what's insidious about it is that throughout the year, I've been earning 20% on my earnings, and then in the final part of the year, if I go into the higher rate threshold, you're then talking 40%, just out of nowhere. Then comes problem number 6. Lifespan. London taxis are only allowed in London for a maximum of 15 years, and that has no bearing on what the condition might be. Bearing in mind that these taxis need 2 MOTs a year and an annual overhaul, this could be in the best of condition. I might not even use the taxi, I might leave it in a garage for 15 years. But at the end of 15 years, Transport for London deemed that this taxi is too old, I'm no longer allowed to use it in London. Now historically, we sell them off to less stringent authorities, let's say Manchester or Liverpool, etc. But it goes from being a workhorse of a vehicle, some equity in it, to what we've seen with the diesel taxis where there's pretty much nothing left in terms of money. You sell them off for about £1,000 at maximum. So who knows what this taxi might be worth in 10 years time. But I'll be 43 years old once this taxi's finished. And I've got to have a good hard look and say, do I really want to enter into finance? Having nearly 10 years of freehold on this taxi, i.e. not paying a monthly payment, would I really want to go back to paying over £1,000 a month for a new taxi? There might be some equity left in this cab that I can roll into a new finance payment and bring those payments down. But it's still something I have to think about. It's not like paying off your mortgage where it's done. You have to come back round and do it over again. There really is no one-size-fits-all approach. You've just got to look at your own personal finances and ascertain, am I going to be better off long-term buying a taxi, or am I going to be better off just short-term and knowing I can hand it back? But to give you some context, here's a few other options of how you can own or finance a taxi. So you buy a cab via a hire purchase agreement, and then 3 to 5 years in, you would then chop in your cab. Ideally, you've built up some equity within the taxi, you are then able to get that back out, use as a deposit for your next vehicle, and then your repayments are lower. So you're always still paying something, but you're not doing these gargantuan payments like I was with my very, very first taxi. You're rolling that equity in over again. And it's also good when it comes to taxi ownership because you can then get the newest vehicle and you can still be within warranty and have your servicing plans. If you crunch the numbers over the long term, it probably isn't as good as outright owning the vehicle in the way that I've done, but it's a much smoother ride over the long term. You're not going to get any unexpected surprises or bills come out of nowhere for maintenance, and in terms of expenses, it's a fairly reliable method as well. Your tax bill isn't going to fluctuate as much because you still have some expenses to to be able to put against your tax bill. So overall, your cash flow is much smoother, and your headache of knowing that there might be a big bill coming out of nowhere is pretty much diminished. Or renting the taxi out. There's nothing in the rule book that says I've got to be the only driver of this taxi. Some professions in London bode very well for this. Firefighters, if they're on a split shift, they can share the taxi appropriately. I know of a husband and wife duo. One does the morning shift, one does the evening shift. Yes, I like keeping this taxi for myself because of the freedom of the job, that I can go and earn when I want, that I've always got a vehicle sat on the drive. I could very easily rent it out, providing it has all the correct insurance and that driver is a licensed London taxi driver. So, what is my plan with this taxi? Well, I'm going to enjoy my years of being freehold. I've already got a sizable emergency fund if anything goes wrong on this taxi, because I am out of warranty and all the extended warranty plans were a little bit too expensive. So crunch the numbers and I feel like having just a certain amount saved up is probably going to be my best option. And in the final 15 years of ownership on this taxi, I'll just assess what the taxi trade is doing. There could be new vehicles on the market. London might be completely restricted entirely. I might not be able to do my job at all and I might lose faith in the taxi trade. It's really hard to say what the next 10 years will hold. I mean, if we look back at the previous 10 years, so much has changed. More than likely, in the final years of this taxi, I'll save for a sizable deposit, and then if I have to go buy a new taxi, that will help soften the blow a little bit. Another option that wasn't available to me when I bought this taxi was buying a used one. Now, there was used taxis, but because they weren't used from a dealership, it would have been very difficult for me to get such a large amount of finance to buy a private vehicle. We're talking 50, 60,000 pounds. Would I do it again? Well, if the circumstances were exactly the same, most definitely. The best time to buy a cab like this is if you know you're going to be in the game for the long haul and you've got a few years ahead of you, you are rewarded for playing the long game. This now is the best opportunity for me to go out and earn money and really stack some cash. In theory, if I work exactly the same as I've done over the years, I'll be an extra 13 grand a year up. Obviously, depending on tax brackets and things like that. Effectively, a pay rise for doing the same job I've been doing for the past 7 years. For many of you, if you've got, say, a mortgage, paying off a taxi, that could be all that extra income potential to overpay on that and get your mortgage payments down. Whatever you want to save and invest for. And the golden question. People always ask me, is it still worth getting into taxis? Is it still worth doing? They've asked that question for decades, possibly even centuries, way before my time, and they're going to carry on asking it into the future. If you're a top dog and you've come to London, you've got money to spend and invest and go and enjoy yourself, are you really going to get into a Prius with a sat-nav, or are you going to get in one of these beauties, the London taxi with expert knowledge? I think the answer is pretty obvious. As for me, I'm going to make hay whilst the sun's shining.